And welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today was born in Zanzibar and moved to Britain in the late 1960s as a teenager. He's written a number of works, most notably Paradise, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1984, followed by being longlisted in 2001 for By the Sea. 4 years later, Desertion was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and in 2021 he received the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the first black writer to receive the prize since Toni Morrison in 1993 and the first African writer since 2007, when Doris Lessing was the recipient. He was a lot more gracious in his acceptance than Lessing. His latest book is Theft, a story that captures the life of Zanzibar in the 1990s. Three young people, Kareem, Fawzia and Badar, dream of possibilities for their nation. It's a story of love and friendship within the times of political and economic changes within the country, and how lives are connected and tested through time. Abdulrazak Gurnah, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you.
I'm so interested in your background and the fact that you were born in Zanzibar, and I think that people tend to think they clump Zanzibar together with Tanzania and just think Africa. And it's such a multicultural place. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the makeup, not only of the island, but of the people themselves.
Well, I think you have to think of it as part of a different network almost. Think of it as looking outwards towards the ocean. So a lot of those cultures of the coast, along the African coast, along the coast of southern Arabia, along the coast of western India, these societies have shared centuries of interaction, currents, winds, etc., business, cuisines, religions, and it's still going on in the sense that people still do make these journeys. Now, of course, they don't rely on currents and whatever, but people still make these journeys for work or because they have relatives or whatever. Mm. So the cultural as well as the human mix of people is centuries old and continues.
I mean, there was, I believe, a big Chinese fleet that arrived there a couple of times at least.
Indeed. Chen He, Admiral Chen He. People in China know about him and study him. Kids at school, because I was in China not so long ago, but sometime last year. And I mentioned that there's a conversation, kind of a literary event, Admiral Chen He. And young people know the history of these journeys that were made in the 14th and 15th century before the Europeans arrived in the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. And there were 7 journeys, I believe, altogether. They didn't just go to East Africa. They went through parts of Asia that we now think of as, like Southeast Asia, both trading as well as establishing their power in terms of trade. They went to India and then all the way to the coast of East Africa to a town called Malindi, which is also where the Portuguese ended up when they first landed on that coast. But one of the things that you see as evidence of all of this is that if you do stroll along those beaches in Kenya, you find shards of pottery which are celandon, which can only come from China. And so there is still evidence, lying about of these journeys, but there is also textual evidence because the Admiral's people, Admiral Chen He's people, wrote about their experiences of going to these places. But unlike the Europeans, they preferred China, so they went back.
And the Europeans, of course, largely stayed. Tell us about the colonial history of the island.
Well, there is, first of all, the Omani colonialism. The Omanis challenged the Portuguese. Before that, I suppose the early 16th century, Zanzibar would have been quietly self-governing. The first strangers to arrive and to try to establish themselves were the Portuguese. And because they were already having issues with the Omanis in the Gulf, because they tried to establish themselves there as well, the Omanis basically chased them to the East African coast and established an empire there, both in Mombasa as well as in Zanzibar. So the first colonialism, if you like, was the Omani colonialism, which lasted unchallenged, more or less, really, for at least 100 and something years. And then the Europeans arrived. Between them, they were parceling out various bits of the world anyway, not only in Berlin, but also in actual practice. And so they made their own deals, and Germany got this part, the mainland part, which became Deutsche Ostafrika. The British decided they would have Zanzibar because it was, it suited their purposes more, because it was more mercantile, more navally useful to them, and so on. So they just divided things up. So Zanzibar became a protectorate, which is just another euphemism for colony, in 1896. So it's very, very late in the day, really, when it was only one of the last few bits that wasn't a property of a European nation.
And it remained so until 1968.
64. Well, part of that kind of great stampede to get out of the colonies, at least to administer colonies. And so in the 1960s, not only the French, of course, disappeared more or less, at least as an administrator of African territory. And the British more or less did the same thing. So Tanganyika rather, as then was 1960, became independent. Kenya, 1963, Zanzibar, 1963, Uganda, I think, 1962. So within 5-6 years, gone.
But then there was internal strife.
Then there was a revolution, Within a month of the departure of the British, there was an uprising, which resulted in both in the forced departure of the Omani Sultan, and ultimately in various persecutions and dispossessions and terror.
So your family had been there for generations?
Part of my family had been there for generations, my mother's side.
And you were born there within sight of the harbour. Tell us more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the part of the town we grew up in, where all of us, all my siblings were born in the same house, actually, was within sight of the docks. You could, from the upstairs window, you could see the ships coming in. You could see the island across from the town. You've been to Zanzibar, so you know what I mean. There's the island from the promenade. You can see 2 or 3 of the outside islands, the reef, basically. You can see all that. And in those days, it used to be that when a big ship was coming in, the harbour master, who of course would have been a colonial official, would put up a flag to announce the nation to which that ship belonged. So you could, from our house, see there's a ship coming in. And if you're interested enough, you might go down to the docks to see what it is. But there are two harbours, if you like. One, which was the modern harbour, and the other, at the back of it, was the old harbour, which is where the sailing ships would come in. And every year during the monsoon, the musim, as we call it, there would be these sailing boats that would come from various different parts of the Indian Ocean, from Somalia, from Southern Arabia, from Oman, Iran, India, and they would come in the monsoons and trade. And then when the currents and the winds changed, they would go back. And this happened every year. And they were right there. Again, you could see all of this from our house. In front of our house, was a kind of a square, I suppose, a clearing, with a mosque in one corner, a couple of shops there, a cafe there, and so on. This big clearing would become a place where these people who were coming from wherever, Karachi, or would come and set up a kind of stalls to sell their stuff. So we could see them, they were there. You could hear languages, people singing their songs, fighting a lot. And, it was great.
And your own language, Swahili?
Swahili, yeah.
Which in itself is a kind of mishmash of many languages.
It is not mishmash.
No?
No. Swahili, like a lot of languages, that is to say literal languages that are coastal languages, it is basically a language which has the same syntactic structure as most other Bantu languages, as they're called. But what's different about it is the vocabulary. So because it's kind of open to all these influences, it borrows a lot of words from other languages. But how the grammar, if you like, works is not very, very different from other languages, Ikizulu.
Shona. Yeah.
You can hear there's certain words, for example, or certain ways of forming a sentence which are very similar. In Swahili, you have a root, and then you have various prefixes and suffixes that you add onto it. A bit like German, actually. But that structure is the same structure as many other languages. But what goes into those, that is to say the vocabulary, is informed by the coastal people's contact with Arabic, with Hindi, with Portuguese.
Absolutely fascinating. And this was your original language. You grew up speaking Swahili. Educated in Swahili or in English?
That's curious because in primary school, all the teaching was in Kiswahili. All the teachers were local people, as it were. And even in English classes, the teacher would be speaking Swahili, but teaching English words, kind of thing. And then if you're lucky or good enough, you would go to secondary school. It was a rare thing because during that period, we were still a colony when I was at school. And there were really only 2 secondary schools in all of Zanzibar, one for girls, one for boys. So you imagine that's about, 60 boys actually go to secondary school and possibly 60 girls. Other people, we all did an exam a little bit like the 11 plus, but it's a national one. Everybody does the same exam in all the islands, that's Zanzibar and Pemba. And then 60 of those lucky people go on to secondary school. That, when you get there, almost all the teachers were European. Now, the thinking would have been either that this secondary school teaching required skills which local teachers didn't possess, or it was jobs for the boys and girls. Whichever way it is, there we go. At the age of 13 or so, you go on to secondary school, and everybody's talking to you in English and teaching you in English. And it was actually quite a difficult experience to switch suddenly, even though we've been taught a little bit of English, but not enough to understand algebra being taught to you by somebody who's talking in English. But we managed.
And was that then your introduction to literature in English?
No, I was already reading. There were books that were produced specifically for colonial education. I think there would have been the same books that were studied by people in the West Indies as well as in other parts of Africa and possibly in Asia as well. And they were produced under the direction of a colonial education policy, which was made in London. And these would be books that were thought the right sort of books for us to read. And they're often, or always abridged to make them easier for us to consume. So for us as the boys' school, the kind of thing that we would have been reading would have been books that are adventure stories, Kidnapped, Treasure Island. What else can I think of?
Dickens, possibly?
Possibly Oliver Twist, yeah. But very, very abridged, very short, no more than about 40 pages, you imagine, reducing those books to. So you're really basically just reading a summary.
Yeah.
That's the kind of reading we were doing. Unless we found books which we did elsewhere. And these books sort of were handed around by hand, as it were. Oh, here, this is a good book, read this kind of thing. What
about African literature?
Well, it hadn't started appearing in any big form yet. If you remember, the first kind of general distribution African novel would have been Things Fall Apart. And that was 1958 when it was published. But by the time it actually reached us, it would have been more like 1962, 3, that kind of thing. In fact, the first African writer I heard, or subsequently read, but heard first actually, was Ngugi, who was then still using the name James Ngugi. He hadn't changed his name to Ngugi Thiong'o. And we were listening. It was during the period of the revolution. And my aunt and I were listening to the radio because it was more or less the only source of information about what's going on. So we were listening to the radio, and it happened to be the World Service, the BBC World Service. And it was a magazine program which had a kind of review of a new book by a young Kenyan writer. And here's an excerpt from it. And there it was, Weep Not Child was the book. So that's the first time I knew about an African writer. And then, of course, he became what he became.
You went then to Britain, you finished your education there, and you went to the University of Kent in Canterbury. You did a PhD, and your thesis was on the topic of criteria in the criticism of West African fiction. And I just find that very interesting. What led you to that? I mean, obviously this early exposure was part of that, but clearly there wasn't a huge amount of West African fiction widely available to the world at that time, was there?
Well, there was more than you think. There was a fair amount. But actually, the reason it was West African fiction is because in those early years, so I was doing that in the late 70s when I was writing my PhD. And as I said a moment ago, 1958 was things fell apart. But between that 1958 and, say, 1978, when I was working, in that period of what it is, 20 or so years, an enormous number of books had suddenly appeared. The work of Heinemann African Writers series, there must have been more than 100 novels that had appeared. Some of them were translations from, I think the African writing in French was ahead of African writing in English. Some of them were translations, and some of them were new books that were commissioned or were bought by Heinemann. So there was plenty. But the really important thing was that there was a lot of argument going on about criteria. What do we call African literature? What is it? It's kind of a little bit premature, really, in that it would perhaps have been better to wait until the literature had enough body before wanting to decide what is and what is not appropriate. But, things can't always wait to work out exactly as you wish them. So there was a lot of argument about what constituted the criteria, and so my interest was really to challenge some of those ideas.
And what was your conclusion, and would it differ now?
No, I believe that it was, I think the drift of my argument was that it's too soon to be prescriptive about what these criteria are, or rather that it's more important to allow space for different voices and for whatever. And so the ones I celebrate in what I do, what I study, are exactly those writers their work is not amenable to being prescribed. So no, I don't think I would change it. Perhaps I wouldn't engage with some of the critics as seriously as I did, but then that's what happens with PhDs. You write it, you finish, and then events have kind of more or less moved on.
You're an academic, but you did then start writing fiction. Was that because you couldn't find fiction from your own part of the world?
It's true. But I was actually writing fiction more or less at the same time as I was working on my PhD. So it wasn't like I waited for one before starting the other. And it's true. While I was studying this literature, it was, to me, quite clear that I couldn't see myself in it. I couldn't see the world I was describing to you when we started, this interpenetrated world from different places. I couldn't see that. So that's one of the reasons, anyway, for writing. The other is just whatever people write for.
Yeah, and everybody's still looking for the answer for that.
Yeah.
I want to talk specifically about Theft now,
Okay.
your latest book, which means we really need to go back to Zanzibar and talk about the changes from when you left. So Zanzibar, for instance, in the 90s, when this is, because there was an explosion of tourism. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. Previous to that, I'll tell you what, when I was a teenager, when I was growing up, when I was actually living in Zanzibar, there were no tourists. Or the only tourists were those big liners that used to go from Durban to Portsmouth or whatever. And they would stop in Zanzibar for half a day or for a day. And you'd get groups of people coming off the ship and sort of walking around in a daze and then going away. That's what tourism meant. And then after the revolution, there was no possibility of tourism largely because there were so many foreign exchange restrictions that you just would not be able to go there because you wouldn't have any money unless you bring it with you. What made the difference was in the mid-'80s, these foreign exchange restrictions were lifted. And that was the first opening for tourism. At first, mainly backpackers and budget tourists and that kind of thing. Then as other tourisms along the coast of Kenya collapsed, then more and more upmarket tourists started to come. And now there are lots. I think it's probably now the biggest earner for Zanzibar. Tourism brings many good things, brings jobs, brings investment, brings a little bit of peace because the government can't go around bossing everybody as it usually likes to do. But there are also corruptions of various kinds. Corruptions of the system because of the various commissions that investors are able to pay. Corruptions of people's mores, people's values, which are now, or people are being seduced into other ways of being. Not always necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes a bad thing.
This book's set in the 90s. So what was the situation in Zanzibar at that time?
It was important because it was a kind of a period of transition from that earlier period, a period of both austerity and also to some extent of authoritarianism. It's not that now there isn't authoritarian climate, but it's not like it was. It's not frightening like it was. So it's a transition also because there's I think, a different generation. If I may say so, much better educated. Unfortunately, not educated in Zanzibar because the education system in Zanzibar has collapsed, and this is one of the tragedies, one of the sadnesses about the way the government works, because they can afford to send their children abroad to study. But in any case, there's a generation of better educated people who are thinking differently, I think. I think this is contributing to progress in the sense of in the minds of people. And tourism has made a difference. TV has made a difference. Many other things. People are more open. There is more debate, I think, both in the mainland as well as in Zanzibar. You have to remember that Zanzibar has its own government, even though it's one nation. But really, it's not one nation. So one always has to qualify, saying it's happening on the mainland, but it's also happening in Zanzibar. So the reason for the period is to try and catch something of that transition was before the 90s. It doesn't just focus on the 90s, because some of the events are consequences.
And you're examining
before.
Examining historical, injustices, really.
Yeah. So it's best to see what was before and the consequences of them now, and how we're moving forward. So that's why 90s is interesting, 90s, 2000s.
It's called theft. Have you ever stolen anything?
Me? I remember when I first came to England, and I was just astonished at a number of books everywhere. And I remember stealing one book from W.H. Smith.
What was it?
It was the poems of John Keats.
I'm sure John Keats would have approved, don't you think?
But yeah, I mean, he wasn't getting anything anyway from those
exactly. books. But the theft of the title is not just one act of theft. It is about, as I say, these historical injustices too, and how the social dynamics work. It's about class, it's about wealth too.
It's about different kinds of thefts as well, thefts of people's lives, of their youth or their happiness, but also the hotel, the Tamarin Hotel, is a stolen house. There is an injustice also of a false accusation of theft. So there are different kinds of thefts.
Tell us about the three young people at the centre.
Yeah, well, I started in my thinking. I started with Badr, who's the one who is a powerless young person when we first meet him. Well, kind of for quite a lot of the novel. But he's falsely accused of stealing. That's where I began. So I wanted to sort of examine that injustice and how it comes about and what a person does when falsely accused in this way. So that's clear. That's why I had him. How does he cope? So then I thought of the other young man, Karim, about the same age as him, maybe a little bit older, who's more fortunate, but he's more confident, he's got at least part of his family, his intelligence, his whatever. So, and he becomes his mentor to some extent. So these two has interesting relationship between two young people, two boys, and then two young men. And I was also originally thinking of a woman who suffers from epilepsy as a child. And I wanted to bring these together, these three ideas: injustice, how a person like Karim makes his way, and how a girl child growing up with this burden, or rather the burden is on the parent's side, worrying about epilepsy, how she will cope. So all of them have some kind of a dilemma or problem to deal with. So I wanted to see about how people find their way in the world, really, people like this, with these sorts of undramatic issues, really. How do they find their way in the world, and how do they find their way together? Because at some point they come together. Those are my three. But of course they don't come unattached.
The mother.
There's the mother. There's the absent father. There are various people who are also part of what they have to come to an understanding of and move on.
I mean, and you say it's not dramatic, and it's a short book, but it's just really, it's compelling. It's absolutely compelling.
Well, that's nice of you to say that.
The sort of literary traditions that go into writing that, and I'm asking obviously because we were speaking about African writing generally, but what about sort of influences from the Quran or from Persian or Arabic poetry?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, all of these things that a person reads become part of how you generate your own voice. I don't see the way I write as being part of a tradition, as it were. Of course, it doesn't stand alone like some kind of voice invented out of nothing. But I don't locate it by saying this is influenced by, say, the Quran or etc. It's a way of understanding, as I see it, way of understanding both what I've read in European or rather English literature, stories I've heard elsewhere, stories that I make up myself, and out of this, I like to think that comes something mine, something of my own. And I don't think this is unique. I think this is what writers do. They make something which is different out of a variety of things. And they don't write like Dickens. They don't write like Nabokov. They write like themselves. So in that respect, I think, I will count all the various influences. But out of it, I hope I've generated something of my own.
Completely your own. And it's a wonderful book. Abdulrazak Gurnah, thank you so much for speaking to me.
It's been a pleasure.
Theft is published by Bloomsbury and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Steph Chungu, who also edited the show. And you can download this programme and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.